Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor. My guest today is a returnee to our show, John Steele. John is a licensed marriage and family therapist who has focused his practice on treating high-performance clients, including athletes and professionals. With personal experience as a former collegiate athlete, John combines the complexities of the athlete's experience with the performance of professional life. His specialties include treating anxiety, trauma, grief, addiction, and building mental fitness. Whether working with athletes or high-achieving professionals, he helps his clients combat shame, build healthy coping strategies, and increase self-compassion amidst high-pressure environments. Today's show, we've brought John back on to discuss curiosity about self without harmful judgment for athletes and high-performing professionals. John, welcome back to our show.
It's good to be back, Graham. I'm excited.
Nice to have you here. Well, hey, as we welcome you back to the show, in our first podcast together, which I highly recommend you listeners checking out, it was a great time, great discussion. We had a chance to start with your history as an athlete, and I want just to ask if you'd give us a quick summary today about your sports history and what led you into this current focus with your practice, working with high performers.
Yeah. Well, for me, as far as an athlete, it started real young. I'll put it that way. I think right around maybe that 2, 3, and 4 years old, my parents saw the activity in me and they said, hey, we got to get you in something. So let's do sports. So, from then on, I absolutely loved it. The one that I got to play probably the longest was baseball. And that one was from the T-ball age all the way up to I got a chance to compete at the collegiate level and got to pitch. And so that really kind of shaped a lot of my athletic career. Went through a severe arm injury. So that's something that I look back now and really is a part of my story. Specifically in regards to some of these topics, that we'll touch, whether it's the curiousness without judgment, the resilience, being able to bounce back, things like that are such a big piece. So, a big part of that is, I went through the world of Tommy John. So, if you're familiar, right, with baseball, just about everyone has Tommy John now. And that's just a part of the way that it goes. But that was a big part for me in regards to not only just the identity piece and the recovery during that time, as well as a lot of transition happened, for me, a scholarship got pulled because of it. I had to move to different schools, things like that. And so that was a real big shift, in life for me. So that's kind of the, athletic side for me in regards to my career and what I was able to go through.
Well, you know what I love? I love that you've blended together, your athletic career. Sometimes I think it takes one to know one. You got to be involved in certain things, I think, to be able to have a real resonance with folks as you're talking about it. And I love that you blended your athletic history being quite successful and then what you went through, subsequently with the Tommy Johns. And that's a very, very challenging injury. And I love that you blended all of this with this mental health career that allows people to understand the mental, emotional side of not just being an athlete, but going through different seasons of your life as an athlete. Let's jump into our topic if we could. We're talking today, as I mentioned in the intro, about being curious about oneself without harmful judgments. What are you talking about here?
Yeah. So this one, Ted Lasso fan at all?
I have not watched it, but I've heard only good things about it.
I will throw that at you a little bit, okay? So if you get a chance, get to that Ted Lasso. But that one, so there's a scene in Ted Lasso where he hits this quote, which is this, be curious, not judgmental. And that one stuck with me as, throughout just like my journey, I would say. But that one stuck with me because of what it means to hear that tone of curiosity versus judgment, right? And I think to me, the judgment piece, there is positive feedback that you can get, right? Criticism, like you need that as an athlete, as a high performer, as a person, just getting better. The harmful judgment, though, that's the spot where you can really get stuck.
Yeah.
And I think for me, what I loved about that combination was it said, hey, let's actually do something about that and let's be
Mm.
curious about it.
Yeah,
And
that's
the
good.
way that it sounded, it just brought this kind of freedom to it and
Yeah.
not a restrictive, harmful judgment feel.
Well, it's an interesting thing because as athletes, as professionals, and whatever you're doing in life, and you're in a relationship, whatever you're doing, you have to judge. You have to do an evaluation. You have to assess. If we can kind of bunch all those words together: assess, judge,
Yep.
Evaluate, take an inventory of. But the piece you're saying is why we have to do those things in order to improve. If we can remove the hurtful, harmful piece of it, and it almost sounds like curiosity is a nice way to kind of take a road through all of those things without there having to be something attached to it that can be harmful to us.
Right. I mean, I know it's right on. I think for the harmful judgment piece, it really brings that pain and hurt that you feel, but towards self. And when that self hurt and pain happens, that's that spot where I think where you talk about this resilience in life, and you talk about how, especially, as an athlete, I can pull from so many scenarios to where in game, right, where I literally remember throwing a pitch and watching it get hit off the lights in left field, right? Like it literally hit the lights. Like that is like in a movie,
Right. Right.
And I'm turning around like that was the worst thing that ever happened. I
Right.
can't believe that happened. And yet I got the next pitch, right?
Yeah.
I got the next guy, next person that's showing up. And so there's something about this environment that you can curate to create this bounce back. And the harshness or the harm in a negative judgment, right? Like, because I think you can throw those in there. The difference between a negative judgment and maybe that positive judgment, that positive feedback, that criticism that's there, is it attacks self, is what it does.
So one's going to be regressive that really puts you at risk for this being a compounding thing. There's going to be a snowball effect. One mistake leads to another mistake. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in our first podcast, but when I used to coach, I talked about this idea of letting go. I was thinking that the most important play is the next play. And like you just said, the most important pitch is my next pitch, not the one that just got knocked out of the park and hit the lights. It's the next pitch.
Yep.
And if we don't let that prior one go, whether it's good or bad, we can build upon good, but we're going to carry things, particularly the negative is going to be regressive. I used to get my basketball players. I'd pick one out of the crowd or one out of the group, and I'd put a backpack on them, and I'd say, okay, here's a brick.
Yep.
And this is a mistake you made, and you don't let it go. You don't flush it,
Yep.
And so I had him run to half court and back. He was like, that's not the big thing. So I put another brick in because this is another mistake he made because he didn't let the first one go. Yep. And by the time that he was, doing the drill, he had like 8 bricks in his backpack. Poor guy was running backwards, almost to half court and back. But the idea is that don't let something go. We carry it with us, and it affects, negatively impacts in an aggressive way, like you're saying, how we can be successful. Or we can take it in a positive way and say, hey, I can learn from this. So I always think we're either winning or we're learning. And make a mistake. Well, what am I going to do next time? So this is what you're saying here about letting judgment. We have to judge, but in a right way.
Yeah, I think there is, right? There is a kind of this way that allows you to move through those situations versus getting stuck, and I think that's the spot, exactly what you're talking about. Whether it's through athletic experience now as being, a MFT and working through specifically trauma, I would say is probably the one that I've learned so much about in regards to that stuck.
Right.
When things become so overwhelming that you still want to do some of these things, and yet you're hitting something, right? You're getting stuck in that way. And that harmful judgment, that core belief is one of those that I think can help you. Or it can increase that stuck.
I would love to hear more about this piece because I think this is critical in everything we do, no matter what you do in life, athletic or otherwise. that trauma coming into these things, and a lot of people don't even recognize the trauma that they carry. And trauma doesn't always mean that, someone had a 9/11 event or they had a big car accident or got jumped. It can be other traumas that can be relational. Traumas of when someone, little Johnny comes home and he says, "Hey, Dad, can we go out and, hit some balls together?" And he said, "I'm tired. I don't want to do it." Or comes into Mom and says, "Hey, can we play catch?" And she said, "I've been a long, busy day." Well, this child walks out with a self-meaning that maybe I'm not important or maybe I don't matter. And so I better perform so that I matter or I'm important someday. And they carry this with them through their whole life, like what you're saying here. That can be a trauma. It's a relational trauma that we make self-meaning out of.
Yeah.
Talk about the traumas that you're seeing kind of in commonplace, we could say that really impact this recovery process or just the curiosity process, maybe.
Yeah, I think one of the core beliefs that I recognize, right? There's this activity that we can go through sometimes, I'll put it this way, with trauma training. And when you're working through trauma is identifying your negative belief.
Sure.
And this could be specifically to that memory, right? Or that experience that you walk through. I'll back up real quick too, Graham, because I wanted to say, I love what you're talking about as well as trauma and defining that.
Yeah.
Someone once mentioned to me, like, the idea of trauma is really within the body and the person's experience. It's not defined, right, by what society might say is trauma. Literally, it's the body and its fight, flight, freeze response getting stuck.
You bet.
And like you mentioned the kid, that's so important that people can recognize that.
Yeah.
That there are these experiences.
I think we have, we got the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and that's kind of our Bible for diagnosing, isn't it? And there's some really great stuff in that allows us to identify things and nothing else to bill accordingly with with the CPT code. But it's very limiting sometimes. So we would say, well, it's very clear you had a trauma if you watched 9/11 or you got jumped or something happened to you really profoundly negative that you cannot miss. But there are more subtle, more nuanced traumas. And I like the definition of trauma that I've used for many years. It's an event outside the realm of normal experience. Well, how does that work? Well, I come home and ideally my folks pay attention to me. They've got the bandwidth to do it. There's safe boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. And when those things aren't there, then our body does react to it. Our body holds a memory like you're suggesting here, and our emotions react to it. And those all get embedded, don't they? Even in our neural pathways. And that's where it becomes impacting. Say more.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It becomes impacting in that way and it carries, right? It carries throughout and it gets reinforced. And as that gets reinforced, the core part of that is really that belief and getting into that belief. And what I've recognized, whether it's in trauma now or just being able to work with others and myself as well, this is a personal piece too,
right?
Is that can change.
Yeah.
That there's hope in that these core beliefs can change. And when they do change, it's powerful.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Whether you're a longtime or first-time listener to Behavioral Health Today, you're probably familiar with Triad, the company that brings you this podcast. But you may not know that Triad also hosts a community for current and aspiring behavioral and mental health professionals, featuring trending content and education and career resources, all for free. If you are a behavioral or mental health professional, or you're studying to become one, join more than 80,000 people on Triad by claiming your free professional account today. Visit us at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT and join the Triad community today.
It is really powerful. You're talking about something that's really key, this idea of conditioning and pairing situations that become kind of our normal way of thinking and believing and acting. I'm really interested around how you take this encouragement and maybe even partner with people in a curious way. Hey, let's get curious about how maybe unintentionally, unknowingly, naively, you've actually reinforced, conditioned yourself unnecessarily to think this way. Walk us through that piece.
Yeah. So I think the first part of that, when people hear curious, it's intriguing to see a different light turn for them. When maybe I'll use that word. Okay, let's take a moment.
Right.
Let's just be curious about that. And there's something about, at times I can literally see the shoulders drop.
Yeah. It's inviting. It's not like, oh, hey, let's go find the areas that you suck in, you know, or let's go find the
Exactly.
areas where you failed. There's no, let's get curious. I
Yep.
bet they just kind of relax a little bit.
Yeah. There's literally that movement. I mean, on my couch right here that I see clients, I can see it where it just goes down, and they settle in a little bit more and they feel a little bit more of that. I think inviting is right on what you said there. And so as that curiousness, then we get a chance as the guards are maybe coming down a little bit, because naturally so, the body has guarded, right? It's guarded what it's gone through and it's tried to protect in so many ways. And now we're trying to invite and trying to bring in some of the re-meaning that occurs, and trying to identify that, hey, okay, let's take a moment and see. And so I'll throw out a few key phrases
Please.
that I think I've stumbled upon that have been helpful as I've gone through. So one of them is, I am enough.
Yes.
Is probably one of the ones that really sits at the deep core level. The recognition that, when I'm walking away from something, or I've done something, or even though I gave up that massive bomb, right, in pitching, right? If I can walk away with, I am enough, I'm okay. There's some of these things that are helpful in being able to change and transition from the other side, which is usually the I am not enough. That's the negative core. That's a part of that.
You bet.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's one of the phrases that
Give me
I've
another one.
recognized.
Yeah.
That
I'd love to hear another. I think that's powerful, because
Yeah.
I remember one time I was playing ball, and I was in high school, and this really tall guy was guarding me. I shot the ball. I did a turnaround jump shot in the key. I shot the ball over the backboard. Check this out. I came down, next play. It was the same kind of play. I thought I had him this time. He was way up in my face. I shot the ball over the backboard a second time, and the gym was packed. So those kinds of things condition. Maybe I'm not enough. Maybe I'm just I'm just this guy that shoots the ball over the backboard or gets it knocked out of the park. But give me another phrase.
Yeah, so
I'm not enough.
Yep, right. So I am enough is a big one. Another one is, I'm doing the best I can.
Nice.
That one has stuck with me probably more recently. I have a more recent story about that one, if I can.
Yeah, please.
So that one, right? So I have over now it's probably about 6 or 7 years, I've picked up triathlons. And so just training for them. And I mean, I've gone through the whole gamut of not being able to swim at all, thinking I was going to sink the whole way, to being able to complete them.
Good for you.
To most recently, my venture was, okay, I want to improve my running. And so I hopped on the half marathon, and to train for that and to go through that process. And so I went through, and most recently, I'm down here in the San Diego area. They have an area called La Jolla, Torrey Pines, right? There's this spot where I got a chance to run up it in a practice run once, but it's like this beast of a hill. And so going through the half marathon itself, I felt pretty darn good as I was going through it. And it hits about mile 4 or 5 where you go up this hill, and it feels forever. It's probably a good mile and a half to where you're just running up this pretty steep grade. Got through it and realized that I had probably left most of myself on that hill.
Oh,
I was pretty done afterwards, knowing that I still had probably, about 7 miles left to go. And so it was one of those that I realized, as I've talked more about this phrase, and realized that I had to practice it hard. I had to tell myself, I'm doing the best I can.
I can't.
That is it. I'm doing, and it translated into, for a while, I would walk up the other hills and I would run down the other side. And I just did that to complete it. Yeah. And so it just, it's one of those that, as a phrase, I think I've realized that it really has an impact to encourage yourself and say, I'm doing the best I can.
Remember Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, either way, you're going to be right. And what you're talking about here is the narratives that we have in our head, and they can be empowering, or they can be disempowering. They can be progressive, they can be regressive. And it's what we're saying in our head in that moment. It could have been, you know, and whatever we're doing, more times than not, we've got a narrative going all the time. And it sounds like part of what you're saying about how we have reinforced our narrative to make it more conscious. That's what we get to do in therapy, isn't it? Make the unconscious conscious.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying, hey, what is your narrative? Let's be curious about what it is. And most people may not even recognize it. Or if they do, they don't recognize how powerful it is. So phrases like, I am enough is a quick reframe. It's a quick change in the narrative if it's going down a negative path. Or this idea of just a self-acceptance of I'm doing the best that I can in this moment. I love these phrases. Is there another one that you have found effective?
The other one I would say as well, it kind of translates into, I would say, in the mode of high performing athleticism and perfectionism.
Yeah.
So where perfectionism can kick in, the I am okay portion, that one has stuck out to me specifically when just recognizing that mistakes happen, even though my perfectionist voice will tell me mistakes don't exist.
Right.
And you know, there's so much to that as well, but just that phrase specifically and being able to repeat it and get to this portion of belief that I'm actually okay
You bet.
with this, and specifically for me with maybe this mistake.
Yeah.
You know,
that's powerful.
I can look back and I can say, you know, I've gone through this mistake and I actually am okay. I can go back through the history of things that have happened, you know, for me.
What I like about that too, and all these phrases, I'm enough, doing the best I can, you know, I am okay. If we don't monitor these things become very shame-based. You know, it's not what happened to me. It's who I am that causes these to happen. Shame is what I did. Guilt is what I do. And you're talking about here the real risk of shame being reinforced, because athletes, they're the man in the arena. They're the ones that are putting it all out there for everybody to see and critique, et cetera. And what you're trying to, I think, protect here is this shame-based view that easily athletes and others, this show applies to everybody. This is an athletic mindset we're talking about here, but it applies to everybody. You're trying to ward off shame being inappropriately reinforced in one's life when adverse experiences happen. I love this shame-based piece.
Yep.
Do you notice that?
Yeah, big time. Big time. It really is. And, you know, just like we were talking about, I think in the idea of trauma, and what I think I've recognized in the hope is change. And just like that shame, and in this case, I think you're right on the shame message, right? Those negative core beliefs are what gets attached to these experiences that we go through, and specifically negative ones, right? The trauma aspect. And being able to change that is hopeful to me, is recognizing that hope exists. And what it takes is some of this practice, right? Some of this,
really good.
You got to see it, right? I think that's probably one of the biggest things first you got to identify it, right? You know, I got someone that come in and they'll sit down and, you know, we're talking through a lot of the symptoms, right? We're talking through, okay, we got to manage the anxiety level, right? We got to figure out a way, maybe breath is a part of this practice and what that means. And then as you're getting into that, then you're starting to say, okay, can we be a little curious about, and I'll say this, can we be a little curious about that should? So someone once pointed out to me, and this is, I carry this with me, is the difference between shoulds and coulds in the way that you speak. And someone once, I was telling them a story or something like that, and they stopped me and they said, "What? Who's telling you all this stuff?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about? Who's telling me what? Like you're saying all these shoulds. Who's judging you? Who's telling you
Who's the
that
panel,
you're doing right? Who is that? You know?" And from then on, it just blew me away. And I'm like, shoulds. And I recognized in my speech, I was shoulding all over myself, right? Like, you know, like it was one of those things that was a part of life. And I had to consciously say, okay, first, let me do this. Let me take a moment and see how many shoulds I'm saying. And so this is an exercise that I run through with clients as well. And I say, okay, let's just take a tally. let's be curious again, right? Let's just observe. No judgment here. Let's see how many times you say should in a day, in a week time frame. As you do that, see what it feels like to replace some of those with coulds. And then recognizing that there's a lot more. To me, I could recognize the breadth. I can recognize the options that started to happen. Like, yeah, instead of I should have ran 7 miles today, it became I could have run 7 miles today, but I had to drop my kids off early. I had to pick them up later, right? Like there's just so much that's
I did the
part
best
of
I
that.
could. Yep.
I did the best I could. So today it was, I got a mile and a stretch in. So we'll live with that.
That's really good. I would love to take a little bit deeper dive into this. 2 things.
Yeah. Yeah.
One, give us a story or two of folks, maybe somebody's come in, it's got a little bit of a hallmark case around this idea where you got to be curious with them and maybe them kind of being enlightened in their own mind of, I never even saw this, or what you're seeing. And maybe just along with the story, kind of a little bit behind the curtain of what were you doing to help make them more conscious of these things, and then how that began to transform into something progressive for them.
Yeah, how it switches, right? You can see the way that they keep changing.
Yes.
I think as you're saying that, I can think of an experience with the client. This one, virtual client, right? So just like this, right?
Yes.
And we were working through, at the time, addiction work and moving through that as best as we could. And the difference that I could see is when they started to embrace the idea of just that word curious.
Yeah.
And you could start to see them sit with it more.
Yeah.
And you could start to see. So what happened is as that's happening for them and they're recognizing this curiousness, they start to experience a little bit more of the freedom that brings versus the constriction that brings. That when I say that, constriction of maybe some of the negative judgment, right? That's been a part of life.
You bet. Shame for sure.
Shame, big time, right? That is just naming it. It is the shame that ends up being constricting in that way versus something that can open that up a little bit more and more. And so at least in the experience of that, what I would do is kind of overwrite video like this as I start to hear some of their language, gently, refer to, hey, I notice this about you and what you're saying. Is there a different, either maybe way that could be said, or is there a different tone to that? Sometimes it gets into the place, and this is a practice from self-compassion. Kristen Neff is just a big name in self-compassion and what she does. Absolutely love her stuff. But there's an exercise of this idea of how would you speak to a loved one in this situation? And the ability to separate from oneself, I think, is huge, right? You need to get that separation sometimes.
Yes.
So that then you can speak to that loved or respected person in a way. I mean,
almost like your little bit wiser self, your more compassionate self, that I would never say this to somebody, or if I saw somebody in this state, I would talk them out of it by saying something like this. So you're talking about pausing long enough to be curious about, what are the voices in my head? What is my narrative? What have I reinforced unknowingly, more times than not, that could actually be contributing to my trauma that keeps me stuck in something, whether it's shame-based or otherwise, whether I'm trying to maintain a stable sobriety, or whether I'm trying to work through an athletic injury, or whether I'm trying to work on, my marriage, whatever it may be. This idea of making that more conscious, and then beginning to maybe do little tweaks in terms of how I might rephrase that. And that can change the trajectory of everything, it sounds like.
Yeah, it can. I mean, it brings, I think, some of just the best ways I've seen it, even had clients describe it, is there's a difference between breath and constriction. And when they're feeling literally in the sense of like they start to get tight, right? The
Mhm.
breath starts to get shorter because of some of the impact of those shameful messages.
That's so
It's
good.
got a physiological effect to them. And
Yes,
then
it is.
being able to recognize actually experiencing a little bit more breath
Mm,
to it, a little bit more openness, I think is
so
one
good.
of the things that I start to see kind of that like flicker, right? That light start to
Yes.
click on a little bit more.
Yeah.
And it's something that they recognize that it shifts from let's say it shifts from a white knuckling, I just got to try and do this, to that felt good.
Yes.
You know, there's a positive reinforcement that starts to occur.
Yeah.
Okay, you know,
Yeah.
that kind of breath that can happen when you are making those shifts, making those changes in that dialogue.
It's so good. You referenced earlier about that physiological way that we are hardwired around the fight or flight,
Mhm.
and how when that system gets kicked into play, we can easily be along for the ride, not recognizing what we're in. And everything becomes, like you're suggesting, very myopic. But we're looking, at life through a tube or through a straw. And we're missing out on all the other pieces. But when we're in a panic stage or a shame-based place or judgmental-based place, like you started us out with today, that's where everything becomes really problematic. And, I used to do some biofeedback, and we can measure skin temperature, and we can measure stress levels by one's temperature. Because what happens when we're tense, like exactly what you're saying, the blood vessels become constricted, and they're further away from the dermis, the skin, and your temperature goes down. But when we take breaths, like you're saying, everything dilates, everything opens up. And then so does our aperture and the ways that we might see things, might be curious about things. So this is really good work,
Yeah.
really exciting work.
I mean, it's just very cool to be a part of and see
Yeah.
and experience, because these are things that not only I see as far as clients go, but it's something that I've experienced as well, from the moments of a half marathon that I feel like I'm failing.
Right.
That's the message I get. You're just a failure because you're not doing it, right?
Just go be a couch
Versus
potato.
right,
Yeah.
wait a
Yeah.
second, I'm actually okay, and I'm doing the best I can, in
So
this
good.
moment, and just being able to work with I think really it's the power of the dialogue, that's there. And that's what's really been one of these things that I have loved about, in this case, being curious, being able to identify judgments. I mean, from the shoulds to coulds, that's with me today. That is with
Yeah.
me today. That will forever be with me
Yeah.
to identify. It's
I,
powerful.
I think these shifts, we don't always have to make big shifts, but if we look at how we aim, let's say a firearm, if we just make just a little change, the trajectory over time is huge.
Mhm.
And we don't need to make quick, big leaps or big turns. Sometimes just a small little thing like, let's put in a could versus a should, or let's be curious versus judgmental. What if I said to myself, I am enough, or that was good enough? Or what if I'm okay? As a person, what if I'm okay and I can learn from that, that error right there? Or what if, I'm doing the best I can? You know what? I'm in the race today. I did a I can swim now. I couldn't
Yeah,
swim
all of
before.
that.
Yeah,
Yep,
all of it.
yep,
And I
yep.
don't have to have my water wings on when I swim. I can swim now in real ways, which is kind of
It's
cool.
true.
That's
It's
so
true.
good, man.
I could have
That's so
used them
good.
though. There's no doubt at the very beginning. I could have used those water wings.
That's good. That's good. Well, you know what? We could. I love talking with you, and I love your mindset, and I love your
Mm,
approach to things, and I love that you're blending. These things we're talking about athletically, but they're applicable. You were talking about a guy who's trying to maintain a stable sobriety in his life and bring his true self back into his life. And
mm,
these things apply to all of those. And I love the
mhm.
idea of being curious, without judgment. Given my enjoyment, I have to be realistic here, and we're going to need to wind this down. But I'd love
Okay.
to have, if you could, give us kind of a takeaway message, to those listening today around ways that they can continue, in addition to what they're hearing today. Just an
Yeah.
encouraging message around, hey, what if we became curious more and more in our lives, and what we can
Mhm.
expect from doing so?
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, right there, one of the things I love, being able to just say those words, like the be curious, stay curious without judgment, with, I think, the hope that that involves. I'll say, one of the things I've been more involved with lately is this idea of mental fitness.
Yes.
And what that can bring to whether it's mental health or just the area of life, and the hope in finding some areas of control amidst life that can feel so out of control.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good.
And
And these are hopeful things.
Mhm, they are. Yeah, they are. Then they're hopeful. And, I was listening recently to even the difference between hope and optimism.
Hmm.
And recognizing that how hope really is an action, that hope brings this activity to it versus getting stuck even in the optimism, because optimism can be like the head in the clouds sometimes, right? It's not the
Right.
reality that you are facing.
Hmm.
But really, in this hope that you can have, there are these moments that I think you can find some of this control, this, let me take a moment and breathe
Yep.
right now, right? Even before it's, we've done this, right? Before, right, Graham? And even before this, I had to go settle myself a little bit. Whether it was the energy or the nerves, I had to say,
Right.
okay, I'm just gonna take a moment and breathe a little bit,
Yeah,
settle
so
in.
good.
So from those kinds of things, I hope not only the message of being curious without judgment, but being able to find hope in that as well.
Fantastic. Well, this is a great message and applicable to each one of us. I would love our listeners to be able to follow up with you, John, after our show today. I know you've got a YouTube channel, you got a podcast, and your own work and your own therapy with folks. Give us some ways for folks to follow up with you after the show today.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's been fun to I'll kind of venture out into whether it's YouTube or podcast world a little bit. So you can find me at Mental Fitness Stories with John Steele. That's my YouTube channel. You can find it on different podcast platforms as well. And then johnsteeletherapy.com is, for me, as far as being a marriage and family therapist and working within that realm as well. And so you can find me there. I'm on Facebook too, and you can find me at John Steele, LMFT, all those things. So,
Excellent.
but
I know you're also on LinkedIn. I know you're on Psychology Today.
yep,
So these are additional ways too. I want folks to find you.
appreciate
Well,
that.
my brother, it's always great to have you with us on the show. Welcome back today.
Hey,
It's so nice to have
yeah.
you. And we're going to have you back and we're going to have some further fun in our conversations. But for today, thank you so much for being with us.
You bet. No, I appreciate it, Graham. Definitely.
Thanks so much. Also want to thank you, our listeners, for dropping by and joining John and me today. It's always great to have you with us. Regarding our episode today, I want to remind you that it and all of our archives of all of our other episodes and resource materials can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. Thanks again for being with us on the show. I look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.